Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. Boxing Day 1898. In the farming country around Gatton, Queensland, the Christmas holiday was drawing to a quiet close. For three members of the Murphy family, the evening offered a simple plan: travel into town for a dance, spend a few hours with friends and neighbors, then return home. Michael Murphy went with his sisters, Norah and Ellen. None of them would make it back. By the following morning, Gatton would be at the center of a mystery that has never been solved. Michael was 29 years old, Norah was 27, and Ellen, the youngest of the three, was 18. They belonged to a large, well-known local family living in the district south of Gatton. This was a rural community, the kind of place where families knew one another and journeys were measured by the pace of a horse. A dance was more than casual entertainment. It was a social event, and on Boxing Day, it gave the siblings a reason to dress up and head into town together. They traveled in a light horse-drawn cart. The road toward Gatton passed through open agricultural land, with farms, fences, and patches of scrub on either side. There was no street lighting beyond the township, and once darkness settled, the route would have been difficult to see except by moonlight or a lamp. Still, it was familiar country. Michael and his sisters had no obvious reason to expect danger on a road they knew, close to a town where they were recognized. But when the Murphys reached Gatton, they learned that the dance had been canceled. Accounts differ on some of the surrounding details, but that central fact is consistent: there would be no celebration that night. Their planned evening ended almost as soon as they arrived, so they turned the cart around and began the journey home. It should have been uneventful. Instead, somewhere along that return trip, the cart left the main road and entered a secluded paddock. Now here's where the story becomes difficult to reconstruct. No confirmed witness ever provided a complete account of what happened inside that paddock. We know where the siblings were found, and we know something of the violence inflicted on them. But the sequence of events, the number of attackers, and the reason the Murphys left the road all remain uncertain. Were they forced to turn off? Did they recognize someone and stop willingly? Or did something happen before they reached the paddock entrance? The next morning, when Michael, Norah, and Ellen had still not returned, concern spread through the family. A search began along the route they should have taken. Their tracks could be followed from the road toward a paddock, away from the normal path home. There, searchers found the cart. Nearby lay the horse, dead and still attached to the vehicle, and close to both were the bodies of the three Murphy siblings. What appeared at first to be a missing family search had become a triple murder investigation. Michael had been shot and struck with a blunt weapon. His injuries suggested that the gunshot alone had not ended the attack. Norah and Ellen had been bound and fatally beaten. Their clothing and the condition of the scene raised further disturbing questions about what had been done to them, though surviving reports do not always agree in their descriptions. The brutality was unmistakable. This was not a sudden roadside accident or a robbery that had gone wrong in a single moment. The violence had been deliberate and sustained. The dead horse added another layer to the scene. Killing or disabling the animal would have prevented escape and made it much harder to move the cart. It also suggested control. Whoever was responsible had managed to bring three adults and their horse into an isolated area, or had confronted them once they were already there. Either possibility would require confidence, force, deception, or some combination of the three. And that leads to one of the case's central questions. Was there one attacker, or were several people involved? A lone offender would have faced obvious risks. Michael was an adult man traveling with two adult women, and all three could potentially resist or run. Multiple offenders might explain how the victims were controlled, yet one determined attacker, especially one armed with a firearm and known to the family, could also have gained an immediate advantage. Investigators considered both possibilities. The physical scene offered clues, but before those clues could be documented properly, the paddock was overwhelmed by people who came to look. News traveled quickly through Gatton. Neighbors, relatives, local officials, and the simply curious began arriving. The scene was not secured in the way a modern homicide scene would be. Sightseers walked through the paddock, gathering around the cart and bodies. Footprints overlapped. Objects may have been handled or shifted. Any clear distinction between tracks left by the killer and tracks left by visitors rapidly became harder to make. Evidence that might have helped investigators was being damaged before trained detectives could examine it. It's worth pausing here because this was more than a minor procedural mistake. In an outdoor crime scene, the ground itself can tell a story. Wheel marks can show how a vehicle entered. Hoofprints can indicate whether a horse was led, driven, or turned suddenly. Footprints may reveal how many people moved around the victims and in which direction they left. But once a crowd crosses the same ground, those patterns become confused. At Gatton, the first hours after discovery were among the most important, and they were largely lost. The bodies were also moved before senior detectives arrived. The decision may have been made out of practical concern or respect for the dead, but it further altered the evidence. Their original positions could no longer be studied with confidence. Knots, clothing, blood patterns, and the relationship between each victim and nearby objects all required careful documentation. Photography and forensic practice were still developing, but even by the standards of the time. Preserving a murder scene mattered. In this case, preservation came too late. The early medical examination created another serious problem. During the initial autopsy, the doctor did not locate the bullet in Michael's skull. That failure mattered because a recovered projectile could potentially be compared with a suspect weapon or at least examined for its size and characteristics. Michael's body later had to be examined again after burial, and the bullet was eventually found. By then, valuable time had passed, and confidence in the medical handling of the case had already been damaged. So let's back up a second and think about what investigators were facing. They had 3 victims, a dead horse, a cart in a paddock, signs of extreme violence, and no reliable eyewitness to the attack. They also had a contaminated scene, bodies that had been moved, and physical evidence that had not been collected correctly at the first opportunity. Every hour increased the distance between the crime and any useful lead. Memories shifted. Travelers continued on their way. Tracks faded under weather and foot traffic. Responsibility for the investigation passed through a police system that was poorly organized for a case of this scale. Communication was slow, officers did not always coordinate effectively, and experienced investigators were not placed at the scene quickly enough. Local police had to manage an enormous public response while also attempting to identify suspects. Rumors multiplied faster than verified facts. Some people claimed to have seen the Murphy cart. Others reported strange men, unusual behavior, suspicious weapons, or conversations that sounded incriminating after the murders became known. More than 1,000 people were eventually interviewed. That number gives you a sense of the investigation's reach. But it also shows the problem detectives faced. Each statement had to be checked against times, locations, relationships, and other testimony. Hundreds of letters from members of the public entered the police files. Some writers offered sincere observations. Others passed along gossip, personal suspicions, or elaborate theories. A large file can look like progress, but volume is not the same thing as reliable evidence. The Murphys' movements on Boxing Day were examined again and again. Investigators tried to establish when they left home, when they reached Gatton, who saw them there, and when they started back. Any unexplained interval might identify the point where they met their killer, but witness recollections were not always precise. Watches were less common, rural travel times varied, and people who had seen a cart in darkness could not necessarily identify its occupants. Even a confident statement might become uncertain when tested against the rest of the timeline. Attention also turned toward people who knew the district well. The paddock was secluded enough to offer cover, yet accessible from the road. That could suggest local knowledge. An outsider might have found it by chance, but someone familiar with the area would understand where a cart could be taken without immediately attracting attention. Then again, familiarity with the land did not prove involvement. Gatton was surrounded by residents, workers, travelers, and seasonal laborers who all knew parts of the countryside. Suspicion could spread widely without narrowing the field. Investigators considered whether robbery had been the motive, but the character of the attack made a simple theft explanation difficult. They considered personal hostility, sexual violence, and the possibility of an offender with a history of violent behavior. They examined known criminals and men whose movements could not be easily accounted for. Yet every theory ran into the same barrier. There was no preserved chain of physical evidence strong enough to connect a particular person to the paddock and exclude everyone else. There were reported sightings and suspicious characters, as there often are in a major unsolved case. Names entered the investigation, were discussed, and sometimes remained in public speculation for decades. But suspicion is not proof. Some alibis were incomplete, some statements contradicted one another, and some individuals behaved in ways that observers found strange. None of that produced a case strong enough for an arrest. Without a dependable witness, a confession supported by evidence, or a clear forensic link, police could not cross the gap from theory to prosecution. The condition of the scene also made it difficult to determine exactly how many offenders had been present. Footprints that might once have answered that question were mixed with those of searchers and sightseers. The way the victims had been restrained could suggest planning, but it did not identify who tied them. The different forms of violence might indicate more than one weapon or more than one attacker, yet a single offender could have used several methods. Each clue seemed to open possibilities rather than close them. Public frustration grew as those possibilities accumulated. The murders were horrifying, the victims came from a respected local family, and the killer or killers appeared to have vanished. Newspapers followed developments closely and criticized the authorities. For the Murphy family, this public attention came with an additional burden. Their private grief became a subject of national discussion. Every rumor about motive or suspects pulled the family back into the case, while the most basic question remained unanswered: who had taken Michael, Norah, and Ellen from them? By 1899, criticism of the Queensland police had become impossible for the government to ignore. A royal commission examined the force and its handling of major criminal investigations, including the failures surrounding Gatton. The commission's findings were sharply critical. Delays, weak supervision, poor communication, and confused responsibility had damaged the inquiry. The problem was not simply that one officer made one bad decision. The investigation exposed organizational failures across a police system that was not prepared to respond efficiently to a complex rural murder case. That distinction matters. It would be easy to tell this story as if 19th century investigators simply lacked modern science. Of course. They did not have genetic profiling, computerized records, or today's laboratory techniques. But the Royal Commission was not judging them by 21st century expectations. It criticized failures recognizable at the time: delays in sending capable investigators, inadequate protection of the scene, poor cooperation, and uncertain command. The Gatton inquiry did not fail only because technology was limited. It failed because basic opportunities were mishandled. The missing bullet during Michael's first autopsy became a particularly clear symbol of that breakdown. A bullet is tangible. It can be recovered, measured, preserved, and compared. When it was overlooked, buried with the body, and found only after a later examination, the mistake was impossible to dismiss as mere bad luck. It showed how evidence could slip through gaps in procedure, and if something as concrete as a projectile was missed. What less visible evidence had disappeared in the crowded paddock before anyone understood its importance? Even after the Royal Commission, police continued pursuing information. Statements were reviewed, suspects reconsidered, and public tips added to the records. But investigations have momentum, and the strongest momentum usually comes in the first hours and days. By the time authorities had organized a broader response, the scene could not be restored. The victim's final movements could not be replayed with certainty. People who had passed through the district were harder to locate. Every later theory had to be built on a foundation already weakened by the initial response. Over the years, the Gatton murders attracted proposed solutions. Some theories centered on a local offender. Others suggested travelers, men with criminal backgrounds, or more than one attacker acting together. Certain suspects appeared compelling when viewed through one piece of testimony, then less so when their movements or the reliability of a witness were examined. No theory has gained enough evidentiary support to become an accepted solution. The case remains a warning about how easily a plausible narrative can be mistaken for a proven one. And there is another question that lingers. Why did the cart leave the main road? If the Murphys were threatened at gunpoint, the turn may have been forced. If they stopped for someone they knew, it could suggest trust or familiarity. If there was a problem with the horse or cart, the move might have begun innocently before the attack. That single action sits near the center of the mystery because it may reveal the killer's method. Yet the people who could explain it died in the paddock. Today, it is tempting to imagine that modern forensic testing could settle everything. Perhaps preserved clothing, bindings, the bullet, or other physical material might contain usable traces. But evidence from a case this old may be incomplete, contaminated, lost, or impossible to place in a reliable chain of custody. Even if a biological profile were recovered, identifying when and how it reached an object would be difficult. Modern science can reopen possibilities, but it cannot always repair what happened at the scene more than a century ago. What survives most clearly is the timeline's devastating simplicity. On December 26, 1898, Michael, Norah, and Ellen Murphy left for a dance. The event was canceled, so they turned toward home. Somewhere on a familiar road, their journey changed. The next morning, they were found beside their cart and dead horse in a secluded paddock. From that point forward, confusion followed. A crowd at the scene, disturbed evidence, moved bodies, delayed detectives. And an autopsy that missed the bullet lodged in Michael's skull. More than 1,000 interviews and hundreds of public letters could not undo those first failures. No one was arrested, no one was tried, and no official conclusion identified the person or people responsible. The Royal Commission forced Queensland to confront serious weaknesses in its police organization, but institutional reform could not give the Murphy family an answer. The investigation became both a murder mystery and a case study in lost opportunity, showing how the handling of a crime scene can shape everything that comes afterward. So when we remember the Gatton murders, the focus should remain with the three people at the center of them. Michael Murphy was 29, Norah was 27, Ellen was only 18. They set out expecting music, company, and a safe journey home. Instead, their names became attached to one of Australia's longest-running unsolved cases. The theories continue and the old files still invite examination. But after all this time, Boxing Day in Gatton holds its secret. The Murphy siblings' killer, or killers, remain unknown. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.